atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Well, bloodied but unbowed. So happy to be here.
There you go. All right. Well, I was thinking, Jay Carson, defender of freedom, not only not convicted, but not even indicted of anything, which we can't say for everyone.
Convicted? No, never convicted. If you're old enough to get that, again, we salute you. So.
Yeah. Now, before we do get to not just indictments, but convictions, I want to mention new podcast, not a new podcast, but a podcast that might be new to you called How Do We Fix It? And they focus on, well, how to make the world a better place. And I think we could all get behind making the world a better place. And if we can't, well, that's a kind of a serious problem. But anyway, recent episodes of the podcast that look at things like ranked choice voting, and everyone knows I am a big fan of that. The collapse of local.
There's a weird assumption that would make the world a better place, but continue.
It's a fair assumption. Anyway, why this? Jay, you'll like this one, Jay. Why diversity is great, but DEI isn't. There you go. There's something.
That might be that would be something I'd be interested in.
That's what I'm saying.
That sort of sums up my beliefs. Yeah.
So there's stuff for everyone there. You should check it out. And also, I should mention that in the latest episode of my other podcast, Sustainable Planet, Kimberly and I look at something called the green paradox, which is how regulations that limit future greenhouse gas emissions can actually increase greenhouse gas emissions in the short run, sort of an unintended consequence. And that was an interesting conversation, I think. Anyway, you can find both Sustainable Planet and How Do We Fix It wherever you get your podcasts. And I will make sure we have links to both of them in today's show notes. All right. So, Jay, I think everyone knows what the lead story for this week was.
Yes, our lead story is, as the Wall Street Journal reported, regulators are considering significant changes to bank rates relating to capital. No, I'm kidding. Of course, it's Trump. On Thursday, a Manhattan jury found Donald J. Trump guilty on all counts of felony falsification of records. Obviously, a lot of the stuff I'm going to say here is probably obvious, but Trump is the first former president, or any president, to be convicted of a felony. Trump responded, as you might have expected, saying that the verdict, the trial was crooked. The Democrats who brought it were thugs. The legal case, regardless of where one stands on the verdict, I think there are still some significant questions on the legal case and the next steps from here. And we can get into that. President Biden, for his part, during a press conference relating to Gaza, said that the American principle that no one is above the law has been reaffirmed, and warned that anyone who calls the verdict rigged is engaging in reckless, dangerous, and irresponsible to say that the verdict was rigged just because they don't like the verdict. Now, I guess there's probably not a whole lot more to say from there that hasn't been said as far as the facts go. But Trump will be sentenced on, I believe it's July 26th?
The 11th. July
16th.
4 days before
several days
the
ahead
start
of the Republican convention.
Yeah.
So, Mike, what are your thoughts? Because there's a whole lot to unpack here, from the trial, the verdict itself, the jury instructions, the reaction of both Trump and Biden, and also the where does it go from here piece. So it's mostly your show, so I'll let you lead off with your thoughts.
Well, I've gone back and forth on the charges and on, the law in question and so I look back at that because I thought I should start with that. And I have a problem. I guess fundamentally I have a problem with this idea that there's no necessarily need to specify the underlying crimes or for the defendant to have been proven guilty to those crimes before it can be used as an underlying crime. That just seems weird to me. And somehow
I'd say the Supreme Court would tend to agree with you, but I'll get into that later.
So
go ahead.
But then I looked at the law as written, and well, the law as written doesn't require that the defendant have even committed an underlying crime, only that they had the intent to commit another crime. And so I guess I'm of two minds of this, Jay, is that I don't like the law. But the law being what it is, it seems to me that, well, the prosecution made its case, and certainly Donald Trump and his attorneys had every opportunity to counter that, to point out what I think are some of the problems with it. But yet the jury unanimously and very quickly came back with the guilty on all counts verdict. So I'm okay with the process. I don't think the process was rigged or anything like that. And I do agree that that sort of language is irresponsible. But I do think it's reasonable to say, hey, this is a bad law, but you can have a bad law that is, applied correctly. And I think that is sort of how I come down on this.
So I would quibble with the defense had every opportunity. There's going to be some issues that they're going to be raised on appeal, obviously, regarding, in some cases, evidence that they wanted to present but were precluded from presenting. For example, the federal government's choice not to follow up on any of these charges. But setting that aside for a second, I tend to agree that, look, I don't disagree with what the law is. I am concerned with the judge's instructions, and I'll also point out that, as many have said before, and I've said before, the fact that we're sort of getting into this strained, really novel application of this business record falsification statute, and we're applying it in this high level of a case against someone who's running for the office of president, ought to give everyone a little pause, right? And this kind of goes back to what I had said numerous times on the, Roscoe Coltrane versus Joe Friday, right? That if you're going to convict the president, you want Joe Friday, presenting the evidence as opposed to assembling and presenting the evidence as opposed to Roscoe. And for those, I'm hoping all our audience knows who Joe Friday and Roscoe P. Coltrane are, but if not, look them up. Although you actually probably can't see Roscoe anymore. But I think there is a pretty serious issue on the jury instructions on the application of this law in terms of what you just pointed out, that someone is being indicted or convicted with criminal consequences based on findings that are not necessarily unanimous and found by the jury. And there's going to be a case that everyone is going to hear about in the next couple weeks, Apprendi versus New Jersey. And back in the day, it was a 2000 case. When I was clerking for the Federal Circuit Courts, Apprendi was kind of the bane of my existence because it had just been decided, and like every prisoner in the world was now making Apprendi claims that they hadn't before. And the basis of Apprendi, it had to do with a gun spec where someone is convicted of crime, and if they do it with a gun, then you get extra time. But in this case, Apprendi, the jury didn't find the gun specification specifically, and yet Apprendi was sentenced for it. So the Supreme Court said, look, every fact that's necessary to condition the punishment on must either be admitted by the defendant or found by the jury unanimously beyond a reasonable doubt. And I do have some concerns with the way this was structured, in that jurors could sort of come to different conclusions as to what the predicate offense that Trump either committed or intended to commit was. And I think that's a problem that appellate courts may take a look at.
Yeah.
So that's my thoughts on the law piece of it.
But before we get to the second piece of that, I'll say I agree that is at least something that's open for debate. But I think that people who will point to the judge's the jury instructions and say, well, this is clearly an example of it being rigged. When you look at the actual text of the law, it does in fact say, well, when his intent to defraud includes an intent to commit another crime, and it doesn't specify that has to be a specific crime. And so it's not, what I'm saying is it's not an unreasonable interpretation to say, well, it could be any kind of other crime. It doesn't really matter as long as it's another crime. And I agree with you that that's, like I said, at the top, I feel a little funny about that, but I don't think that you can point to that and say, well, clearly the judge is, in the pocket of Joe Biden, who's, coordinating this whole thing somehow out of his dementia. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous conspiracy theory sort of stuff. That I just wanted to.
No, and I think I want to make a point on that, because this sort of occurred to me early on, because I think, what you say in the Court of Appeals is that the trial court erred, and that's the way you pronounce it. It's erred. It's not erred. Just getting that out there. but the trial court erred in instructing the jury the way it did, that it didn't have to come to unanimous decision on the predicate offense and what the intent was and those things. And that's different from saying the judge is corrupt in the pocket of someone of the big Democrats or whatever. And it occurred to me in doing the minimal prep that I do for this show, Mike, that there is something kind of beautiful about the law, in that sometimes, and maybe it's not every time, but judges' intent often doesn't matter if they're right or wrong on the law, right? Whether Judge Mershon misapplied the law intentionally because he wanted to convict Donald Trump, or he just had a good faith view that of the law that's different in terms of what's required, doesn't matter, right? And that's kind of a beautiful thing, in that it allows practitioners and people who are going to argue over the law to take out that personal piece and say, listen, it doesn't matter. Our point is the judge was wrong. The judge got it wrong, and the Court of Appeals needs to fix it. And I think that can be found in a bunch of different places, the way the law works. And I think we'll maybe hit on this in some of our later discussions about the Supreme Court. But yeah, I think there's a way you can now. I certainly think you can make the argument that the prosecution was politically motivated, and that's a little bit different argument than saying that the court is corrupt. But yeah, I think that's. Well, I think that's just an observation. That's just an observation I had, that the judge doesn't have to be crooked; he just has to be wrong.
And I think, I'm glad you brought up that the prosecution's politically motivated thing, because my response to that is, well, yes, of course it was. I mean, Bragg sort of ran for the office based on I'm going to get Trump, but both those things can be true at the same time. A prosecution can be politically motivated, and a person who's being prosecuted can actually be guilty of the crimes of which they're.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
And so I think
my argument would response would be, and this is kind of ground we covered before, is that yes, he can be found guilty, but when the prosecution has to strain and work as hard as it does to get to that guilty verdict, and in pursuit of what is in essence a victimless crime, gives one pause. And I could also say that there's something of the no one's above the law statement, which again, it's sort of a great truism, but at some point it kind of becomes kind of meaningless, because you could say, well, no one's above the law, but you would also say, well, except for every other person who's never, no one's ever been convicted of this statute in this way. So that argument kind of, I mean, that's the problem. The problem the prosecution has, the political problem, and I think that the problem then attaches to Democrats, is the uniqueness of this legal theory and its novelty.
Yeah, I agree that it's an unusual thing, but it's not like the prosecution just made this up, right? I mean, they can point to the law, and so I think people are saying, well, they're just making it up as they go along. Well, not really. And also, I'll point out that certainly many of these arguments were available to the defense, and they were apparently, decided they either were not used or were not persuasive. This was not a jury that had a lot of trouble, and this will maybe get to Trump's argument that, well,
Well, with these questions, of course, would be questions of law as opposed to questions that go to the jury.
Yeah,
right. Should this have been dismissed in the first place because this isn't a real crime? He hasn't named the predicate offenses. The jury instructions were wrong. All that kind of stuff is question of law as opposed to questions of fact, which is what the jury finds.
Good point. And in thinking about those questions of fact, I'm sort of wondering, would it have gone better for Donald Trump if he, for instance, if his attorneys had, I don't know, admitted to the affair, but said, hey, there wasn't an intent to commit another crime? I'm trying to think about this as a juror and thinking like the standard Trump defense to anything that you would want to accuse him of is, I didn't do it, and the people who are accusing me of are crooked, right? That's how he's never done anything wrong in his entire existence. Anyone who says he is obviously a bad person who hates him and should probably be taken out and shot or hung. That's what they do in the old days, right? Whatever. And from a juror's perspective, I think at some point I said, like, oh, come on. This guy's not admitting to anything. This just feels, and I get why politically Trump can't do it. He's gone too far on the I've never done anything wrong ever. I mean, his whole thing is about being this victim, this persecuted victim. So he can't go back on that politically. But it seems to me that it might have made things at least a little more tenable for him in front of this jury. I don't know. What do you think?
So, well, I think that gets to some trial strategy things, and the fact that Trump did not take the stand, which I think was overall a good call, right? Because God only knows. I mean, Trump gets up and starts talking. Who knows what could happen? And the problem with the Fifth Amendment, the trade-off with the Fifth Amendment, is unless you're Lois Lerner, you can't testify and then invoke the Fifth Amendment. It's either all or nothing. So, yeah, Trump would not be able to testify and say, yeah, I did, I shot the sheriff, but didn't kill the deputy, without being subject to cross-examination on the entirety of it.
And, when I think about this politically, it seems that there was one poll that came out, I think it was Thursday. So still, I mean, when this was super fresh, something like 17% of the people said a guilty verdict would make them less likely to vote for Trump. But then again, 15% said it would make them more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Yeah. So I feel like, and that's kind of my sense of this, generally speaking, is it's not exactly a wash. It certainly, other things being equal, it's better to run not as a felon.
It's better not to be convicted.
Yeah, exactly. And so anyone who says, well, this is just what Donald Trump wanted playing into
Mike is Mike has a PhD in political science.
So, I mean, but we'll have more of a sense of this when more polling comes out after people have had a chance to sort of think about this. But my general take is that this is better for Joe Biden than it is for Donald Trump, for just the simple reason that, again, you'd rather not be a felon than be a felon, but also that we've talked about this before, Jay, is that when you're thinking about the case you're making to people, right, the simpler case is, hey, this guy's a felon. And he can't really say, well, no, I'm not. Well, yes, you are. And explaining why that shouldn't matter, that's a longer argument. That's not a bumper sticker argument. So I think that in general, this helps Biden marginally. And of course, in a close election, marginally may be all you need. And Donald Trump will almost certainly be a felon until after the election, because this process is going to take quite a while to work its way through the appellate courts. And so that's my take on it politically. What do you think?
Yeah, no, and I think that's all right. So we'll touch on this just process wise really quickly. The next obvious step would be the New York Court of, there could be other post-trial motions, which I believe may have been filed, but they're filed under seal and so forth to, JNOV and all that sort of stuff. My guess is none of that will get granted. It's not going to matter. So the next step, realistically, is the New York State Court of Appeals. There have been calls in Congress that, could we fast track this to the U.S. Supreme Court? I'm not sure exactly how one does that.
Yeah, I think that's just political posturing.
I think there was I forget who it might have been the Speaker Johnson. If it wasn't, I apologize to Speaker Johnson. But said, the Supreme Court should step in. And as a conservative, the idea of any court stepping in
Yeah.
sort of anathema, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's sort of, no. Courts don't,
But that's the kind of thing you have to say, right? I mean, it's like Marco Rubio called it a show trial. And I thought, my God, man, if you don't know what an actual show trial is, I mean, I would almost feel insulted if I were the victim of a show trial to have it. But that's the sort of rhetoric that you have to do when you're bowing and scraping before, well, not bowing and scraping, but just sort of acknowledging the leader of your party. And we've seen that from all kind of the top level Republicans. Mitch McConnell's sort of an exception, but he's on his way out anyway. And so, but it's disappointing, but not surprising.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would separate the Marco Rubio rhetoric type stuff from actual calls for
Good
another
point.
branch of government to do something,
that's
right?
A good point.
It's one thing to get up and make a political speech. It's quite another to say, the Supreme Court should intervene, or to look at any sort of process that would allow that. I think it would be bad on a whole number of fronts, and I would be highly doubtful that the Supreme Court would do anything or would entertain an early appeal of this. The way it would work is you go to the New York Court of Appeals. If you lose there, you go to the New York Supreme Court. If you lose there, at that point, you seek certiorari from the U.S. Supreme Court, which in light of Apprendi, I think they should probably grant. But as you point out, that is all a year or so down the road. The other interesting thing you mentioned is, the politics. Alvin Bragg may well be sort of a Trump mega donor at this point, in that the day after the verdict, the Trump campaign raised over $52 million, and the website was so busy that it actually crashed. And I think that says something as well as to how does this affect Trump in the long run. But so I think there was this big outpouring, certainly, of cash that had been sort of sitting on the sidelines, and 52 million is not a tremendous number in terms of presidential campaign budgets, but it's certainly not nothing.
But if at the start of it, if you were to ask Donald Trump, honestly, but if you were to ask him, well, would you rather have the 52 million, or would you rather
Again, we'll go with this. We will concede that, again, it's always better not to be convicted.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, exactly. So I guess in the end, politically, it sounds like we're in agreement that this probably has a slightly marginally helpful effect to Biden as this all kind of washes out.
Yes and no. And also, I think a little bit depends on how he plays it, right?
I've been playing it smart, basically.
I think Biden can very, very well misplay this. I sort of expect that he will. But, and also this also occurred to me when Biden is out there and his surrogates, for example, Robert De Niro and Joe Biden making statements that, look, if Joe Biden on The View, if Trump is elected, forget about all your rights. All your rights will be gone. I'm like, all of them? And De Niro's impassioned plea that, Trump will destroy the world, that this will be the last time anyone gets to vote.
It sounds like the kind of thing Donald Trump would say.
What, he got convicted of a felony for falsifying business records. Kind of seems like, you know what I mean? Well,
but I think, if you listen to the rhetoric from Donald Trump, it just sounds like the same sort of thing, just coming from the other side. I don't like it either way, because I know you don't either, because it's so incredibly over the top. But I get why that's happening, because to be heard in this environment, it's not enough to turn it up to 11. Now you need a whole new dial that has a 12. And this is the world we live in.
Well, I don't know that the president, I don't know that either one of them really has any problem getting heard, right?
Well, I
think either if you're Donald Trump or if you're Joe Biden, I think it's pretty easy to get your message out.
Yes, but if you're Joe Biden and you say, well, Donald Trump gets elected, that won't be great, but the Republic will survive, and that's not exactly a stirring call to arms. When Donald Trump, on the other hand, is saying, if Joe Biden gets reelected, the country's just going to keep on going right to hell, and it's just going to be, they're going to come after your guns, and they're going to be abortions everywhere. And, if you can't fight that by just being calm, cool, and collected, that just doesn't work anymore.
Sadly. Why not? Why not, though?
Because
I mean, I guess, I mean, can't, I mean, wouldn't one response be, look at these unhinged crazies?
yes, and that would be a response.
We're for regular order and back to normalcy. And in fact, you can make the argument, others have made it, and I'll make it again, that the reason Joe Biden was elected was the sort of return to normalcy type stuff of, hey, look, I'm just regular, center of the road Joe Biden from Scranton, PA, caretaker president, don't expect anything flashy. It's just going to be, we're going to get rid of the drama. But that's not how he governed. And then that's not how he's campaigning now.
I think, as I often do, that the problem in your analysis of the electorate in so many instances is that you tend to think too much of them. You tend to think they're much more like you. In which case, if more voters were like you, we would have a much better country. I have no question in my mind, yes. But they're not. And so the sort of things
a nation of philosopher kings.
Well, there you go. So that would be an interesting thing. Anyway, any other thoughts on this before we move on?
Yeah, Mike, one more thought that I wanted to add, and this is something I'm sure we're going to talk about in the next month as we get closer to sentencing. But in some cases, Alvin Bragg is now sort of in the unenviable position of the dog who chased the car and caught it.
That's so weird you mention that, because actually this morning, I kid you not, like an hour ago, I was actually thinking that too.
Yeah, and setting aside Alvin Bragg's, the unlikelihood of Alvin Bragg chasing or catching much, he's in sort of a dilemma now, right? That he's going to have to make the case in his sentencing recommendations as to what happens to Donald Trump. He is, I think, politically in a position where he has to go in saying, listen, this demands a serious sentence, including jail time, perhaps significant jail time, because he sort of painted himself into this box. At which point, the way these things work, right? You have a probation department that does this pre-trial or a pre-sentencing report that they give to the judge, and they look at things like the offender's likelihood to reoffend, their age, all these other factors, the seriousness of the crime, the victims, and so forth. And I think they're going to, if you go through that regular analysis, you're going to come up with, look, he's a 78-year-old man who doesn't have any prior record. He does have actually some record of some public service, and he is in the midst of running for president. And Alvin Bragg is going to have to make the case for jail. And it's going to be striking because Republicans, and I'll have time to look it up between now and then, are going to make the argument of, here are all the other folks for whom Alvin Bragg did not recommend jail time. But he is recommending jail time for Donald Trump for falsifying records about payment to a porn star, in essence, lying about sex, which, as we know, is, if not honorable tradition in American politics, at least sort of accepted. And I think that's, Trump will be if you said the admission part of it, Trump could do that sort of, they're trying to put me in jail for lying about sex. Hey, I had sex with a porn star. Come on, I'm Donald Trump. You know me. But put me in jail for this, that's obviously political persecution. I think that card plays right into Trump's hands.
So you think that Bragg will recommend jail time?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. I'm not so
I think he'd recommend the death sentence if he could.
You are, of course, joking, but I don't know. I'm a little less sure of that than you are, but we shall see.
Because here's the problem, is sort of, if we go through all of this and then Bragg says, I think it'd be appropriate if he paid a significant fine of a couple $100,000, I think the base on the left would explode.
Well, maybe so, but I guess maybe I'm giving Bragg more credit than you are. I certainly think that I know that he is an ambitious guy and that he got his job in part on the promise to go after Trump. But you can do that and still be reasonable and within the law and not actually be out for some specific vendetta to push beyond what the law would reasonably call for. And in this case, sure, that would be probation and some sort of a fine, given all those other things you say. And so I will certainly be disappointed if, he recommends any kind of significant jail time because I don't think that that's appropriate in this instance for all those reasons you mentioned. And not only that, but politically it would be stupid, as you point out, because it would, in fact, play right into Donald Trump's hands. So I think it's wrong.
Well, it would be politically stupid because it aids Donald Trump, but it would also be politically stupid for Alvin Bragg to, as his base would say. I mean, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of folks on the left who are fuming because why isn't Trump in jail right now?
Well, there are some. I don't know a lot, but those are the.
But I think that's Alvin Bragg's constituency.
I don't think so. I think that's part of his constituency, but I certainly don't think it's the majority of his constituency. I mean, there are people like me who say, I think Donald Trump is a crook, is a bad guy, and I don't want him to be president, but I also don't want anyone to go outside the law to do anything to prevent him from becoming president, even though I think his becoming president again would be a bad thing. And
that's what I think I would respond, that it's sort of the same. I have the same view of you as you do of me, in that if everyone on the left were like you, Mike, it would be different. But I think maybe you underestimate the vitriol on the left.
Oh no,
I underestimate voters or other folks on the right. So.
I would say in response to that, I don't underestimate it. I think certainly that's true for a segment of the left. Certainly the segment that Fox News loves to talk about all the time. But I think that there are a lot of people on the left who don't necessarily go that far. They're just not the people who make the news, who are talked about because they're not as exciting to talk about.
Oh, that's fair enough. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, anything else on this before we move on?
No, that's it. I just wanted to throw that in there. And that's something we'll have plenty of time to talk about as the summer progresses.
Well, before we move on to our next story, actually part of moving on to our next story, which will be about Justice Alito. Trey and Ken talked about Justice Alito on last week's show, and I wanted to comment on that. As part of that discussion, Ken characterized Alito's opinion for the court as both corrupt and racist. In fact, said that Alito himself was corrupt and racist. And like Ken, I would have voted with Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, and Jackson. I would have dissented. But the charge of racism, that's a new one, at least a new one for Ken to have leveled at a Supreme Court justice. And Ken certainly is entitled to his opinion. And I agree with Ken about a lot of things, including that the court got it wrong here. But I just really strongly disagree with him about Alito being either corrupt or racist. I'm not saying it's impossible. Maybe he is a corrupt racist, but I'm saying that there's nothing close that I see to sufficient evidence to support that kind of a claim, for me to accept that sort of a claim. And ideally, I'm hoping that at some point Ken and I can kind of go back and forth on this ourselves. In fact, we were planning on doing some sort of a short series that examines each justice on the court. And I know that if we're able to pull that off, I'm going to learn a lot about the law and about Supreme Court cases from Ken. But I also think I'll be able to maybe, I hope successfully, push back on some of these claims, which I just don't really think are founded.
So speaking of people who still won't give Justice Alito the benefit of the doubt, Senator Dick Durbin and Sheldon Whitehouse wrote a letter to Justice Alito inviting him in sort of no one's, perhaps even demanding that he appear before Congress to discuss the various flags that have flown over his properties and whether or not they require his recusal in cases relating to Donald Trump and or January 6th. Justice Alito responded that he would not be making such an appearance, which is consistent, I think, with as the Supreme Court has typically done. At which point, Durbin and Whitehouse then wrote to Justice Roberts, again, asking him to order or tell or strongly suggest that Alito come forward and answer their questions. The idea being that because these flags, the upside down U.S. flag flown over Alito's residence, I think the facts are pretty clear that nobody disputes it was his wife who did it, and that Justice Alito even claims I told her not to do it, but there we are.
Well, on that, I love in his response, he said, listen, she owns the house with me, and I asked her to do it, and she just said no, and so it stayed up there. It's like, okay, we're getting a little window into the Alito's marriage, maybe here.
Exactly. And look, I think there's someone. Actually, I should. I don't know. Should I name names? Someone on Twitter. Yeah, I will, because he posted out on Twitter, currently X. John Vecchione, who's a counsel for a sort of right-leaning civil rights group, posted, something of liberals on Twitter. Butker is a threat to humanity because he's saying that people need to control his wives. Also, liberals on Twitter, why can't Samuel Alito control his wife? But he did it much more succinctly and in a clever manner. But that's that sort of thing, right? I think that's. And anyway, this is why you don't usually let me do the introductions, because I started.
No, but I think so. I mean,
all off track. But so we can move forward with. So, what are your thoughts in terms of one, duties to Supreme Court justices' duties to recuse, and or duties of Supreme Court justices to answer questions of senators?
Well, I mean, I go back to the law.
After they've been confirmed.
I go back to the law, and there was an op-ed that Jamie Raskin wrote.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the Jamie Raskin piece. That Jamie Raskin wrote an op-ed in the New York Times arguing that Alito must recuse because of the potential appearance of impropriety and so forth. So I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, and so whenever someone says, well, it's the law, unlike, I guess, a lot of people, I don't know, I actually go to the U.S. Code and say, well, let's see what the law actually says. It's a bizarre way to go about things, apparently. But anyway, Title 28, Section 455, any justice, judge, or magistrate judge of the United States shall disqualify himself in any proceeding in which his impartiality might reasonably be questioned. Okay, well, if you take a look at what Raskin is saying, that, well, he believes that Alito's impartiality might reasonably question the Donald Trump January 6 cases because of those two flags that have flown. And that's not, I don't think that's a crazy thing to argue, certainly. I mean, a reasonable defense is to say, hey, I didn't fly the flags. They were just flown at my house, and take my wife, please, what are we going to do? But, and so, but if we think about the law, what does the law actually say? Raskin is saying that somehow means that Alito has to be forcibly recused in some way, but actually it says that the justice has to recuse, well, it says himself, but there's no mechanism here, right, to get somebody else to recuse that justice. There's no definition of what impartiality or reasonably questioning impartiality is. And I point this out because, as you know, Jay, in so many other parts of the U.S. Code, those sort of definitional things are very clearly spelled out, and they're not here. And so given that, it's not like there's anything anyone can do to force Justice Alito to recuse himself. Now, what Raskin is saying is, well, okay, even if that's the case, what the Chief Justice can do is can not assign Alito any opinions if they're on the same side, because the chief would be the one who would do that. And he can also pull Alito's circuit. Each of the Supreme Court justices is in charge of one or a couple of circuits, actually. Alito's in charge of two of them, saying, well, just pull that, which means that he would no longer hear emergency appeals from those circuits and that sort of thing. So there are things that the Chief Justice could do to exert a certain amount of pressure. I think this is such a horrible idea. I can't even begin, right? I mean, really bad. Yes.
Well, again, a horrible idea. Yes, it's a horrible idea. Well, I'll get again my politics law dichotomy. It's a horrible idea, and I think it's also unconstitutional.
Well, I don't think it's unconstitutional. I mean, Chief Justice that's if you are the Chief Justice and you are on the majority side, you can write all the opinions or assign them to whomever you want. So he certainly could freeze out Sam Alito if he wanted to, and more often than not, they're on the same.
Yeah. No, I meant in terms of the in terms of divvying up work of what the court does. Sure, he can. I was making more to the point of recusal and non-recusal.
Yeah, and I guess I feel I'm troubled, of course, by the fact that we end up having to rely on the justices themselves to decide about whether or not their impartiality can be reasonably questioned, right? Because almost always they're going to say, well, no, of course not. Now, I will point out the statute later on has some specific things saying, listen, if there's a financial interest, if you have represented one of the parties at a lower level, that sort of thing, or in your previous career as an attorney, that kind of thing. And in almost all those instances that I can think of, justices have recused themselves. It's only in these instances where there's no family member, there's no direct financial stake, but it's just like, hey, I think you kind of like this side more than the other side, though it's not like you're going to get anything specific. And yeah, I'm troubled by that, but the more I think about it, and we've talked about this in the past, I can't come up with a better alternative in a lot of ways, right? Because how would you deal with these instances? I don't know, but I can't think of anything that really works out all that well. So that's kind of where I'm at this.
So a couple of things. One, I think you're right. And maybe one I would throw out there, I'm not entirely sure that U.S. Code section applies to Supreme Court justices.
Well, it does say any justice.
Yeah.
I mean, so it does, at least it is, as it is written.
I understand what it says. I'm not sure that it's constitutional as to that point.
Gotcha.
And no one's ever tested it, right? Because I'm not sure that Congress can place other requirements on Supreme Court justices as to whether they sit or not. Now, I think you're right in saying, look, it is sort of a personal decision, which is also consonant with, what, common law has been forever. So there's sort of this idea of we have the statute and then you look to common law as to how has that been interpreted in the past and treated. And again, you're exactly right. In almost every case, when the idea is impartiality of a judge or some other magistrate type person, it goes to, do they have a financial interest? Do they have a familial interest? Do they have something like that? As opposed to, are they more intellectually, ideologically inclined one way or the other, right? And I think you can look at the history of recusals, and recusals in throughout the law are really pretty rare. Usually because judges are competent to set aside if they have other thoughts, feelings, whatever. They're professionals and they can, make decisions based on the law, regardless of who appointed them. And in moving to trying to recuse a judge, obviously, most attorneys, that's sort of a rare and risky move. It's sort of if you shoot at the king, you better kill him. That you don't want to draw the ire of a judge saying that, listen, we don't think you're suitable or we don't think you're ethical enough to sit on this case. So it has to be done fairly carefully and also rarely. So I think you would say recusals are pretty rare throughout the law because the presumption is that you don't recuse. The other thing that is different about the Supreme Court is that, and I think others have made this point before, unlike other courts, if I go into the common pleas court in Cuyahoga County here, and there's a judge who has an issue, and actually this is kind of funny because I actually did have a case where we had 4 judges in a row who recused themselves from a case because they had a potential financial interest in it. And what happens is that, you just get appointed another judge, and we've got 34 of them or something. So you just pull another one out of the hat. But you can't do that with the U.S. Supreme Court. There is a duty to sit that is different than if you're just a district court judge or an appellate court judge who can be swapped out for someone else pretty easily.
Yeah. And I think again, I understand the problem, and it certainly can be a problem, but I can't think of a solution that doesn't create more problems that might even make things worse than they are. The only thing I could think now, before I get into the only thing I can think of, which is kind of out there, but I should also point out that Raskin made a due process argument as well. He cited a case, 2016, Williams versus Pennsylvania. And in that case, there was a judge, and this was, I think, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, I believe. He had been a district attorney involved with this case, and he refused to recuse himself.
Oh, that's a standard. Yeah, go ahead.
And so the majority, and got to the Supreme Court, the majority found that this created what they called an impermissible risk of bias in violation of the Constitution's due process clause. Now, I'll also point out, though, that the dissenters on this 5-3 decision, Roberts, Thomas, and Alito, they said, hey, there's no evidence that this judge was actually directly involved in the decision to seek the death penalty, which is kind of the issue that the court was looking at here specifically. So I'm not saying there's not a due process argument here, though I don't know that exactly, I don't know that exactly applies to this case here. But go ahead, Jay.
So no, I was just going to point out a time that where Justice has frequently recused herself, and that's Justice Kagan, because before she was Justice Kagan and before she was on the Harvard law faculty, she was Solicitor General for the United States. So as a result, there were many cases that she argued or had an interest in that then came before the court that she, when she was appointed. And at that point, she quite properly said, I can't sit on these cases. And you just had an 8-member Supreme Court. So that's sort of the kind of example. And again, that's one of the classic ones that again, is in the case law and kind of typical judicial ethics. If you'd acted as a lawyer on the case, you can't then act as a judge on the case. And again, it's a much more bright line kind of test than like, well, we think they may be ideologically inclined, or because, look, this involves the party of the president that appointed them or something like that. So I guess
what we're left with is that I think we would both agree that Supreme Court justices, being human beings, sometimes are, and in the past have been motivated in small or maybe not so small part by certain biases that go beyond the pale, right? And that's not okay. But the problem is we don't have a way, aside from like stipulating specific kind of financial interest, that sort of thing, we don't really have a good way to deal with that. And the only thing I can think of, hey, you'll love this, Jay, is we amend the Constitution to include a justice removal plebiscite sort of thing, where every federal election, it's my wonderful idea, every federal election, the voters get to choose one justice to remove or
to kick off the island.
Yeah, exactly. To not pick anyone if they think everyone should stay. And so whoever gets the most votes, they're gone. The president gets to appoint someone new. Kind of like, I'm thinking sort of like along the lines of ostracism in ancient Athens, and I actually wouldn't be, I could see the more I think about that, the more I could see kind of why they did it back then, right? Because boy, there are some people I'd sure like to kick off the island, even if they haven't done anything criminally wrong, just to shut them the hell up. And I think, obviously the first two in that list would be Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And I think that the American public could get behind that, I think, in a big way. Anyway, but
Alexander Hamilton is not only turning in his grave, he's rising from his grave.
There you go.
Dislodging the bullets and coming to kill you.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, a very evocative kind of portrait of Hamilton coming for me.
Zombie Hamilton.
There you go.
Yes.
Why don't we close? But we have so much more that we want to talk about that we're going to get to in the midweek show. There's a big case Supreme Court decided that Jay knows an awful lot about. I'm looking forward to talking about that. Some Ukraine, Russia stuff, Donald Trump and the Libertarians, Biden's black voter problem, a whole bunch of things we're going to get to in the midweek show. And if you are a supporter, well, that will be coming up the whole thing for you on Tuesday, like it always is, without any kind of ads or other commercial interruptions. If you're not a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one. You can do that. You can get ad-free versions of everything we put out. You can get the full midweek show as opposed to just that kind of 15-minute preview version of that. And to check the lot, go to patreon.com/politics guys, or you can just, always have the links in the show notes there. You can also support us on Venmo. You can do it on PayPal, all kinds of ways. We are happy to find easy and simple ways for you to give us money so we can keep on doing this thing that we're doing. And finally, before we do go, I should say we would like to thank, especially, as always, our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,